Hello, Assalamu alaikum. May peace and blessing be on you. Today, I've written an article, a very, very long article. The link will be in the description. It is a very timely one, and in the article, what I've gone back to the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, and I've tried. I think that's where the whole Western civilization, I believe, that decay started. Yeah, the beginning of the Gaza genocide, and now whole war with Iran just triggered it to a different level, and I believe this is the beginning of the end, unless something is done about it really. So in the article, I of course have got an introduction, and I have a conclusion and various sections. So the first revelation, America no longer governs itself. So I was trying to say that it's not Americans are not running the country, somebody else is. And then how Gaza destroyed the moral authority of the West, and the war is not, and then how this Iran war is not in the interest of America. And I've gone very, very much detailed into every single one of the things. A lot of research has been done, and I've gone, of course, it's in an opinion piece, and it might not, at some places, is not very, very polite towards the Zionists. Yeah, I'm being very critical of them. Yeah, my disliking of the Zionists is very, very obvious. So if that upsets anybody, I'm apologizing up front. Then Israel's interests and America's interests are diverging. They have got completely different objectives, and the destruction of the West, including Europe, and how basically is damaging Europe so much. And then the Gulf and the global war are turning away from America. Yeah, as a whole, again, big section. And then the myth about American machinery, omnipotence is breaking. Basically, everybody thought that the greatest army in the world, and then it's so much exposed now, and you can see it's all gone out of the window. And then the war abroad means repression at home. So when you are at war, you at home, people's freedoms are taken away. They can't talk, and then a lot of urgent legislation gets passed. Yeah, and people are. It's a blackmail of your citizens, and then the political consequences inside America. What's happening inside America, and then civilizational decay. Then I was trying to wrap it up in terms of how the Western civilization is coming to an end. Now, so it's a very long article, but I think, of course, the whole audio of the article will be played just after my intro here. What I'm going to say a few things. First of all, we are the West, and we love what we have. So as I said, I think in many times before, if we had a choice of living in China, living in Russia, I live in London, where would you live? You wouldn't want to live anywhere else in the world. We love this civilization, right? So I think by its very nature, we owe it to ourselves to be very, very critical about our civilization, to defend it and to protect it, right? So the enemy of the West is the Zionism, yeah? Zionism and Christian Zionism. Now, it is extraordinary. I mean, we never said things was perfect before, but at least there was the framework where we used to operate. Yeah, there was a lot of awful things done before. Yeah, like the wars are not new. We always kind of tried to follow a global norm and principle, right? We always try to do that. Now we are just bare naked, and the whole morality, I think everything is dropped to the low. I mean, a civilization, when the moral decay takes hold, then you lose the essence of that civilization. And that is a downwards hill. You're going to go to the bottom. Yeah, that will be end of our civilization. And So the biggest enemy of us is Zionism. Yeah, this whole Zionist, this barbaric ideology, this supremacist, racist, genocidal Nazi ideology somehow got hold of the whole Western system. And of course, Western system is led by the US. They are the most powerful technology and army in the world, right? And we have seen it's now bare naked as to how the whole system is completely taken over. If you read the article, nobody will be in any doubt that this is not in the interest of Europe or America or anybody in the West or anyone else for that matter in the world, right? It serves only one purpose: to the extremist, lunatics, Zionist, genocidal Zionists who wants this world to end. They've already declared they want the second coming of Jesus. They want the Armageddon. Lunatics. It's just beyond me. I just cannot believe it that I'm hearing this. If some nutcases, this ISIS or somebody, or the guy with the hook, remember, what's his name? I can't remember, in the Finsbury Park Mosque, he should talk rubbish, right? If they were to say something like that, it will be all over the news. And now American army, they're saying this is a religious war to ensure the second coming of Jesus, right? Nutters. They're absolute nutcases. And now, like, America is in their hand. They're calling the shots, right? They're calling the war. And at any moment, they will be dropping probably a tactical nuclear weapon in Iran and destroy this whole world, yeah? What I understand, there is an understanding between Russia and Iran, and Russia might then drop a few, one probably in Ukraine, one probably in Israel, yeah? And that's it. This will be the world as we know it. So these guys are absolutely suicidal. They're maniacs, delusional nutcases, nut jobs, right? Now, I'm saying this because, of course, I'm scared. I think everybody in the West, we should be all scared. But unfortunately, we are all sleepwalking into it. People are so disengaged with politics. But guys, this is not politics. This is your nation. We have to reclaim our nation from this Epstein class. These guys are completely taken over by Epstein. They're evil. They're evil people. And they're all blackmailed. So they no longer serve us, right? Well, in the UK, I believe we're very lucky. We're very fortunate. We're very fortunate because we have got some political parties on the left. They're very strong, right? And there is a possibility we can take over. They can take over. Because there are still very decent people left in politics in the UK. I'm not sure about the other countries, right? Who are not compromised to these Zionist Nazis. They're not compromised. They haven't compromised their ideology. And these people can run our country a lot better for the people, right? But now where I think I would like to focus my little introduction is purely to the Americans, yeah? Purely to the Americans. Because, of course, America is the one leading this, and Europe kind of lame duck. They haven't got much of a choice but to follow America, right? Because of this bond for such a long time. You can't just because a lunatic is in power of the White House doesn't mean you like disengage with America. You can't, because this is like a group of nation. They're so close over many decades of relationship, right? And that made the West what it is. And it is in the interest of the whole world that Western civilization remains as the dominant civilization. But it needs to be dynamic enough for it to accommodate alternative thoughts. Yeah? Because now the Chinese civilization, Persian civilization, Asian, Indian civilizations, all these people, they're all in the West now. They're enriching this civilization. You can see every stage of our life, you engage with people from all parts of the world, different culture. That makes the Western system so rich. And that is why it is so powerful. And it had got so much positiveness in it. Yeah. So this is why we all have to try our best to defend it. Okay? to defend it from these genocidal maniacs and the Zionists who are trying to destroy it. Not only destroy civilization, they're destroying the West. Now, so to the American, I will say, look, the Zionists are trying to destroy America. They've already pretty much destroyed America. They're trying to destroy America, and their next project will be they want to land on another group of Nazis, RSS, BJP Nazis in India. They're as extremist as they are. And then perhaps they will also want to start capitalizing on Russia and China. I wouldn't be surprised, because they think, okay, this civilization declining, China is on the rise, we'll start working with China. The Zionists will do that. Yeah? So this is why I think we need to rise up, because it's extraordinary, isn't it? Now, China and Russia is beginning to look so much better than the whole Western civilization. It's unbelievable. Yeah? Donald Trump is so bad, he makes Putin and then Xi Jinping look like world-class diplomats, right? Because he's so bad, and he represents America, right? But we all know that Western civilization is much, much better for the people all over the world, right? But we got to reclaim it back, because it's in decline. We got to reclaim it back. Now the question is how we do it. And I think Americans can do it, because out of all the nations in the West, America is the best place, in my view. Okay? So I will appeal to the Americans. Now, you have to destroy the seed of Zionism from your nation. Yeah? Now, how you do that is a very, very big question. It will be, of course, a lot of people are doing a lot of hard work right now. Yeah, in American right. And on the left, I'm not so sure really, because this is where it is. I think there's a lot of smaller issues where the left and the right, they kind of make big deals out of, like things like trans and all that. These are not big issues, but the Zionists induces these issues, yeah, on the discussion to split people. So you are splitting, yeah. Americans, you are dividing yourself. Now, this is the time you have to remember, your common enemy is the Zionists. They're the enemy. They're the one who's destroying your nation. They're the one who's destroying this whole world. You got to realize that, okay? So you can have all the disputes in the world if you want to. Left and right will always have that. But on one point you must unite, is to defend your nation, is to protect your nation from these evil forces. You got to do that. So how do you do that? You do that by tackling Christian Zionism with your theology. Yeah? Because in Christianity, this whole description is not right. It's an extremist view. But you have to tackle it. You have to tackle it with that narrative, with the correct narrative. If you think about it, who decides, if you're religious, who decides when the Armageddon is going to be? Who decides that? It's not people. People can't decide, yeah, when the world has come to an end. Is the decision of the God, right? So these nutters, this nut job, this extremist, they're making that decision themselves, yeah, and trying to end this beautiful world. Who would do that? If you are not an absolute nut job, maniacs, delusional, yeah, something is wrong with you. You wouldn't think like that, would you? Right? Now that, as an American, you have to change that narrative. You have to change it. You have to work hard to change that. You defeat the Christian Zionism, yeah? You defeat that. I think that is the main force. If you defeat that, and if the Zionists in Israel use America, their days are over, yeah? And they know it. They know the Gen Zs all over the world, they are so much against them. They know their days are numbered. That concept is finished. So for that, racist, supremacist concept is dead. And Zionists know that. So they are playing their last card. This is what I was saying. They're so suicidal. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they destroy the Middle East. Yeah, I would not be at all surprised. Yeah. Now, I know for sure that everyone in Israel does not hold the same view. Is this extremist? But unfortunately, these extremists are calling all the shots. So what happened to the Israeli left? Yeah, the civilized one. Why can't you rise up, defeat these maniacs who wants the end of the world? Yeah, why can't you defeat them? So you have to bear that responsibility. Yeah, for everybody else in the world, right? So this is what I think. As I said, this is my introduction. In the article itself, I go very deep into the discussion. But my introduction is for the Americans. Please, you wake up. You take back your nation. You take back your nation. You defeat this Zionism, yeah, from your nation, so that your nation can prosper. And world needs America. The whole world needs America, yeah. Because if there isn't any in America, who are you left to it? You know, China and Russia can never live up to it. It can never live up to this Western system we've developed for such a long time. Yeah? And it can survive. It can survive. Once you defeat these genocidal maniacs, it can easily be done. I know it can be done. I appreciate they've taken over the media, they've taken over the capital sources, they're very powerful, right? These evil Epstein forces are very powerful, but people are more powerful. But you have to be aware. People need to be aware. We're in so much comfort with everything we do. We like even to say something, we're so scared. People don't even say anything. They're so happy with whatever they have got. But what they don't realize, they wake up one morning, everything is gone. Right? So the good you have in your civilization, you have to protect it, and sometimes you have to fight for it. Yeah. Now, what these Nazis, what they have made the whole world is unbelievable. Even few years before, you wouldn't think the world will come to this, right? So is this like rules of the jungle now? It's Wild West. Yeah. Look at what Trump did. He went to Venezuela and picked their president up from his house, right? Iranian president killed them on his house. These are, you have broken every single thing you can think of. What is stopping Russia from going in and killing everybody else in the world? What is stopping China to going and doing the same thing all over the world? What happens to the world then? Right? But we are fortunate. The Russia and China are acting responsibly. They're acting responsibly. Unbelievable, right? So it is our job in the West. We got to reclaim our nation. Yeah, we got to reclaim our nation. And what is right and what is wrong? How can anyone with their right mind, yeah, cannot see the Gaza genocide for what it is? How can you not see that? And what they're doing in Iran now, how can you not see that? Don't be a hypocrite, because it's going to come to you one day and that will be end of you. So get out of your comfort zone, reclaim back your civilization, because it is needed for the world. Okay? So I will let you read my article in full. I hope you do. And I hope you find it, I wouldn't say interesting. I hope you find it enlightening, and there is something in it that triggers your mind to do something. Okay? Thank you very much.
Come on, keep up now. I'm trying, it's not easy. Here we go, Trumpy. Time for the order to U.S. Army. Yes, Master.
Introduction. Gaza broke the West. Iran exposes the ruins. There are times when a whole political hypocrisy gives itself away in public. Not in secret. Not through leaked documents years later. Not through some footnote buried in a report no one reads. In public, in daylight, in front of everyone. That is what Gaza did to the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy and the wider West that is totally corrupted by the Epsteinarchy and genocidal Zionism. For years, America and its allies told the world who they were. They said they stood for human rights, law, democracy, restraint, civilization. They said that whatever their faults, they still occupied the moral high ground. They said they were the responsible adults in the room. Then Gaza happened, and the mask slipped. What followed was not only horror in Gaza itself, but something almost as consequential: the complete moral exposure of the Western political class. People across the world watched Western governments excuse, defend, or rationalize the massacre of innocent women and children, and a total destruction of a trapped civilian population by evil Israeli Nazis, and they drew the obvious conclusion: the West no longer believed the values it preached. Or worse, it believed those values applied only to some people and not to others. That was the moral collapse. Now comes Iran, and Iran is exposing something else: the political collapse underneath it. Because this war is not just another foreign policy disaster in the Middle East. It is not just another intervention, another escalation, another round of slogans about security and civilization and evil. It is revealing a deeper truth about the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy itself. It is showing that America may no longer be acting in its own interests, may no longer be fully governing itself, and may no longer even possess the freedom to step back from a war that large parts of its own population do not want. What Gaza did to Western moral authority, this Iran war may do to Western power, Western cohesion, and Western legitimacy. What is as clear as daylight is the unparalleled power of the Zionist genocidal Epsteinarchy, which seems to have placed Western elites under a spell, causing them to lose their morality, their identity, and, more importantly, their very sense of existence. And that is why this matters far beyond Tehran or Tel Aviv. If you listen closely to the voices behind this piece, despite their different styles and emphases, they circle the same core idea. The issue is not merely that war is ugly, expensive, or dangerous, though of course it is all three. The issue is that the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy appears to be sacrificing its own sovereignty, its own economic well-being, its own alliances, its own domestic peace, and even its own civil liberties to a project that does not serve the American people. Again and again, the same warning emerges. This war weakens America, weakens Europe, destabilizes the Middle East, destroys beauty, spreads fear, erodes trust, and pushes the West further into moral and political ruin. The old promise was that American power, however flawed, was at least guided by some recognizable national logic. Maybe it was crude, maybe it was hypocritical, maybe it was wrapped in propaganda, but it was still supposed to be American. What is now being described is something darker. A system so hollowed out that even a president elected in revolt against endless war can be pushed back into it. A political class Epsteinarchy so degraded that criticism is treated as treason. A media environment so warped that obvious failure is sold as success. And a foreign policy so detached from ordinary life that people are asked to accept higher prices, greater insecurity, and the risk of wider war for goals that are never honestly stated. That is not strength. It is decay, and it gets worse when you look at the sheer confusion and incompetence at the top of the American state, possessed by Epsteinarchy. This war is not being sold by a calm, coherent superpower pursuing a clear national objective. It is being sold by an erratic and dangerous leadership in Washington, stumbling from excuse to excuse while the stakes rise by the hour. The stated goals keep shifting: nuclear sites, missiles, regime change, forced surrender, liberation, even the twisted psychotic fantasy that Washington can decide who will rule Iran next. That confusion matters because it suggests that the crisis now consuming the region is not only immoral, delusional, and self-destructive, but also profoundly unserious in the most frightening way. The people pushing it do not seem to know what they are doing, and once you see it, you start to see the wider pattern. Gaza destroyed the moral authority of the Zionist puppy United States, Epsteinarchy, and the West. The Iran war threatens to destroy what remains of their political authority as well. Europe is dragged further into instability. The Gulf states begin to question the whole puppet arrangement that bound them to Washington. The myth of American military omnipotence starts to crack. Citizens at home are told to be quiet, to fall in line, to stop asking who benefits and who pays. Meanwhile, the social fabric frays further. The truth becomes harder to say out loud, and the distance between public language and lived reality grows almost absurd. So this is not just an article about war. It is an article about a civilization in trouble. It is about the possibility that Gaza was the point at which the West lost the right to claim moral leadership, and that Iran may become the point at which it begins to lose the ability to lead at all. It is about a Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy that looks mighty from a distance, but increasingly resembles a country being pulled by forces it cannot master. And it is about the possibility that, unless ordinary Americans find a way to break this cycle and strip that power from those driving it, the Epsteinarchy, this will not be remembered as one more crisis in the Middle East. It will be remembered as the beginning of the end. The first revelation. America no longer governs itself. Every empire tells itself comforting stories right up until the moment reality barges through the door. For a long time, Americans were told that whatever else was wrong with Washington, however corrupt or foolish or captured it had become, the United States still basically acted for itself. You could argue about whether a war was smart or stupid, moral or immoral, but the assumption underneath was always the same. America made its own decisions. America still governed itself. America still had a ruling class that at the end of the day answered to American interests, or at least pretended to. This war tears that illusion to pieces. One of the clearest themes running through this piece is that the central scandal is not simply the war itself. It is the question that sits beneath it. Who exactly is making American policy? Who decided that this was in the interest of the United States? Who decided that American soldiers, American money, American stockpiles, American bases, American alliances, and American domestic stability should all be placed at risk? And why does it feel, to so many people watching, that the answer is not the American public, and perhaps not even the American president in any meaningful sense? That is the first revelation. America no longer appears to be fully governing itself. The point can be stated even more sharply. Trump appears to have been compromised by the leader of the genocidal Nazi, the convict, Bibi Netanyahu. The real issue in this telling was not the nuclear file at all, but Iran's missile system and Israel's determination to destroy it before it became impossible to penetrate. Diplomacy was treated as irrelevant from the start. The warning was blunt. If Washington did not attack, Israel would attack first, and the Zionist puppy, United States Epsteinarchy, would be dragged in behind it. That matters because it reinforces the most dangerous conclusion of all. On the central question of war and peace, the American presidency itself may no longer be acting freely. You can hear it in the fear, frustration, and disbelief of the people speaking across these conversations. Some puts it almost brutally plainly. If the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy either could not stop Israel from launching this escalation or simply bowed to it, then both possibilities are terrifying. Either Washington is too weak to restrain a client state, or it is too compromised to try. Neither answer suggests sovereignty. Neither answer suggests a serious republic acting in its own name. And once that thought enters your mind, a lot of other things begin to look different. Take Donald Trump. Whatever one thinks of him, millions of people voted for him in part as a rejection of exactly this kind of war. That point matters. It matters because this was not some side issue buried in the fine print. The promise was clear enough. No more Iraqs, no more Afghanistans, no more nation-destroying adventures dressed up as moral necessity, no more American blood and treasure spent on causes that had nothing to do with ordinary American life. That was part of the revolt. That was part of the appeal. For many people it was the appeal, and yet here we are. There is a repeated sense that Trump himself may not even have wanted this path, at least not fully, at least not initially. He is described as uneasy, boxed in, pressured, unable to maneuver. Whether that is true or not, the larger point remains. If even a president elected precisely as a battering ram against the system ends up following the same road, then the problem is bigger than one man. Much bigger. Then what you are looking at is not merely betrayal or weakness or hypocrisy. You are looking at a machine that absorbs opposition and turns it into compliance. Once you begin to grasp this, you may feel as if you are losing your mind, because the underlying reality feels dangerously existential. What if the United States, China, and Russia are not truly in control, and all of them are being driven by a force beyond anyone's control, a force that is pushing the world toward the end of humanity? That is the real horror of it, because at that point, elections start to feel theatrical. You can change the mood, change the slogans, change the face on the poster, change the branding of the regime, but the core direction remains the same. The same wars, the same taboos, the same forbidden questions, the same inability to say no, the same deference to power that sits somewhere above the voter and beyond the reach of public life. So the issue is not just whether Trump has failed. The issue is whether the American democratic promise itself has failed, and the instability of the official justifications makes that point even harder to deny. The nuclear issue, missiles, regime change, surrender, liberation, each one appears as a peg to hang the war on after the decision had effectively already been made. That is important, because it suggests not simply bad policy, but a hollow political mechanism in which pretexts are fitted retrospectively to a course already compelled by outside pressure. And the instability of the official justifications makes that point even harder to deny. The nuclear issue, missiles, regime change, surrender, liberation, each one appears as a peg to hang the war on after the decision had effectively already been made. That is important because it suggests not simply bad policy, but a hollow political mechanism in which pretexts are fitted retrospectively to a course already compelled by outside pressure. Many voters thought they were voting for sovereignty. They thought they were voting to restore the idea that the United States had the right to act in its own interest, to defend its own borders, to preserve its own wealth, to avoid pointless foreign entanglements, to stop being manipulated into disasters that made life worse at home and chaos abroad. They thought they were voting to drain a swamp. Instead, they are confronted with the possibility that the swamp is so deep, so interconnected and so protected, that even the candidate sent to smash it becomes another instrument of it. That is a profoundly destabilizing realization. It means that the old faith in the system begins to drain away. It means people start asking darker questions. If the public votes against war and still gets war, then what exactly is the mechanism of accountability? If a president campaigns against endless conflict and then becomes entangled in it, where is the center of decision-making? If criticism of that process is instantly slandered, marginalized, or treated as dangerous, what does that say about who is really allowed to speak in public life? And if every road leads back to the same destination, then how free is the country really? This is where the argument becomes impossible to avoid. The issue is no longer just policy, it is regime legitimacy, because a government can survive mistakes. It can survive blunders, lies, even humiliations. What it struggles to survive is the widespread belief that it does not belong to its own people anymore. And that belief is precisely what this war is feeding. Not only because the war is unpopular with large parts of the public, and not only because its benefits are impossible to explain in ordinary American terms, but because the whole thing has the texture of compulsion. It feels imposed. It feels alien. It feels like something done to the American people as much as in their name. That is why the anger around this conflict has such a different quality. It is not just anti-war anger. It is anti-subordination anger. It is the anger of people who suspect that their country is no longer run for them, and perhaps no longer even by them. And once you say that out loud, another truth follows close behind. A country that does not govern itself abroad will sooner or later stop governing itself at home. If decisions of war and peace can be bent away from the national interest by the genocidal Zionist Epsteinarchy Nazis, GZEN pressure, elite panic, ideological capture, or permanent lobbies of influence, then democratic life becomes thinner and thinner until it is little more than stage lighting around a closed room. That is where America now seems to be standing. Not at the height of confident power, but at the edge of an admission it has long tried to avoid. The admission that the republic is weaker than it looks, less sovereign than it claims, and far less free in its decision-making than its citizens were encouraged to believe. And that is only the beginning of the problem. Because once a people realize they are not truly governing themselves, they do not simply become sad or disappointed. They become volatile. They lose trust. They stop believing the official story. They begin to see every crisis through the lens of manipulation, and whether those suspicions are always right or not no longer matters as much as the fact that the bond between rulers and ruled has started to break. That is what this war is revealing. Not just a foreign policy failure, not just moral rot, but something more intimate and more dangerous. The Zionist puppy, United States Epsteinarchy, no longer looks like a country confidently directing events. It looks like a country being possessed by a demon and then dragged across the dark forest. Gaza destroyed the moral authority of the West before Iran exposed the political weakness of the GZEN. Gaza exposed something even more fundamental, the moral fraud at the heart of the modern West. That is the real sequence here. First Gaza, then Iran. Gaza was the moment when the language stopped working. For decades, Western governments, Western media, and Western institutions spoke in one voice about civilization. They spoke about law, human rights, proportionality, democracy, decency, the protection of civilians, the sanctity of rules, the duty to restrain violence, the horror of collective punishment. These were not small claims. They were civilizational claims. They were the basis on which the West justified its power to itself and to the rest of the world. Then Gaza happened, and those claims were tested in the harshest light possible. And they failed. Not quietly, not ambiguously, not in some debatable gray zone. They failed in front of the whole world, and GZEN became the active participant in Gaza genocide. What people saw was not just a war. They saw a trapped population subjected to overwhelming force, and they watched the political and media class of GZEN, both in the United States and Europe, bend itself into knots to defend, excuse, or soften what was being done. They watched people who never stopped talking about international law suddenly become vague. They watched people who usually speak with instant moral certainty suddenly discover nuance. They watched men and women who would normally flood television studios with outrage choose instead to manage the language, trim the facts, redirect the attention, and tell the public, in essence, not to believe their own eyes. That is what destroyed the moral authority of the West. Because moral authority does not disappear only when a crime happens. It disappears when everyone sees that your principles were never principles at all, only tools. It disappears when the rules are applied to enemies and suspended for clients. It disappears when you discover that the people who claim to stand for civilization will tolerate almost anything, provided the right state is doing it. And once that becomes clear, something very difficult to rebuild is lost. Trust, not agreement, not obedience. Trust. That sense of moral collapse is everywhere, whether stated directly or sitting just below the surface. Gaza was not simply another atrocity in a violent region. It became the point at which the West lost the right to describe itself as the conscience of the world. After Gaza, every sermon sounds different, every lecture sounds thinner, every denunciation sounds selective, every appeal to rules sounds tactical, and the damage was not confined to foreign audiences. It reached back into the West itself. Because Western citizens saw it too. They saw that there was one moral vocabulary for official enemies and another for official allies. They saw that some dead children generated instant moral thunder, while other dead children generated explanations. They saw that some destroyed neighborhoods were proof of barbarism, while others were waved away as tragic necessities. They saw that outrage itself had become political property, rationed out according to interest. And once people realize that, they do not return easily to their old innocence. They become cynical. They become angrier. They stop hearing the noble words the way they once did. That matters more than many elites understand. Civilizations do not survive on force alone. They survive on a story they can still tell with a straight face. They survive on the belief that however flawed they are, they still stand for something real. Gaza shattered that story. It told the world that the moral language of the West could be suspended on command. It told the world that immense suffering could be filtered through public relations. It told the world that power mattered more than principle, and that principle itself could be made to disappear when it became inconvenient. That is why Gaza did not merely stain the West, it unmasked it. And once unmasked, the West became much easier to understand. Its appeals to human rights began to sound less like conviction and more like strategy. Its language of democracy began to sound less like belief and more like branding. Its talk of civilization began to sound especially hollow, because civilization is not just technology or wealth or military reach. Civilization means limits. It means self-restraint. It means that power does not get to do whatever it wants simply because it can. In Gaza, those limits vanished. And when they vanished, so too did the credibility of those who had long insisted that they were their guardians. This is where Iran enters the picture. Because once Gaza had destroyed the moral authority of the West, Iran began exposing the consequences of that destruction. A political class of Epsteinarchy that has lied to itself morally will sooner or later lie to itself strategically. A civilization that excuses brutality abroad will not remain healthy at home. A governing order that can no longer tell the truth about what it supports is already in decline because it has severed itself from reality and must increasingly rely on coercion, propaganda, and taboo to maintain the illusion of coherence. In that sense, Gaza was the warning. Iran is the reckoning. Gaza showed that the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy and its allies had lost the moral ground they thought they still occupied. Iran now shows what happens when a morally discredited order tries to continue ruling the world by habit, by intimidation, and by inherited prestige. It finds that fewer and fewer people believe it, fewer and fewer allies trust it, and more of its own citizens feel estranged from the official script. That is why Gaza cannot be treated as a separate issue from this war. It is the foundation of the whole argument. If Gaza had not already shattered the West's moral standing, this conflict would still be serious, but it would look different. It would still be dangerous, but it would not carry the same civilizational weight. What makes this moment so grave is that the West enters it already morally hollowed out. The old authority is gone. The old credibility is spent. The old language no longer persuades. The same moral corruption carries straight into Iran. A war presented as liberation is described alongside the bombing of civilian targets, the killing of large numbers of civilians, and the public boasting of leaders who speak of murder, surrender, death, and imposed rule as if they were discussing administrative details in the Wild West of the Americas. The point is not only that Western elites tolerated destruction in Gaza, it is that the same class now seems able to market devastation anywhere as a moral act, provided the target has already been turned into a caricature. And so when the same political class that butchered Iraqis under the same false pretenses, rationalized Gaza, now demands trust over Iran, many people simply refuse. They no longer believe the warnings. They no longer believe the humanitarian slogans. They no longer believe the claimed motives. They assume, with good reason, that they are once again being managed, once again being manipulated, once again being instructed to ignore the obvious. That is a devastating place for any civilization to find itself. Because when moral authority is gone, power begins to stand naked, and naked power, however impressive it may look for a while, is far more fragile than it seems. It breeds resentment instead of respect. It produces fear instead of loyalty. It can compel silence but not belief. And eventually, as we are now beginning to see, it starts to fail even on its own terms. So yes, Gaza was a human catastrophe, but it was also something else. It was the scene of a confession. Through Gaza, the West confessed that its values were conditional, its outrage selective, its conscience politicized, and its claims to moral leadership deeply compromised. Iran now enters a world in which that confession has already been made, whether Western leaders admit it or not. And that is why this new war carries such significance. It does not begin from a position of Western credibility. It begins from the ruins of it. And there is another layer to that ruin. Iran and its leaders have been reduced in Western discourse to cartoon figures. That is not a minor flaw in media language. It is a catastrophe of miscognition, the inability and perhaps refusal to see Iranians as part of a serious civilization with its own history, dignity, and rationality. Moral collapse always begins with dehumanization. Once a people are rendered unreal, almost anything can be done to them while still claiming the language of civilization. That is what makes everything that follows more dangerous. The war is not in America's interest if you strip away the slogans, the chest-beating, and the propaganda. One stubborn question remains. How does any of this help the United States? Not Israel, not the think tanks, not the lobbyists, not the television warriors, not the politicians who love to sound grave and historic while other people's children do the dying. America, ordinary Americans, the people paying the bills, filling the tanks, burying the dead, watching prices rise, and being told once again that sacrifice is noble when it is their sacrifice and somebody else's strategy. Again and again, the question keeps surfacing in one form or another, and again, no convincing answer appears, because there isn't one. This war is not in America's interest. It is not in America's economic interest, not in its military interest, not in its alliance interest, not in its domestic political interest, and not in its civilizational interest. It weakens United States in nearly every direction at once, while asking Americans to pretend they are witnessing strength. They are not witnessing strength. They are watching self-harm dressed up as resolve. Start with the simplest measure of all, daily life. What does this war bring to an ordinary American family? Does it lower prices? No. Does it reduce fear? No. Does it secure the border, repair a road, make housing cheaper, improve schools, stabilize jobs, or make electricity bills easier to pay? No. Does it restore trust in government? Quite the opposite. It asks people already stretched by economic anxiety to accept another crisis layered on top of all the others. It tells them to think about unconditional surrender and regional power while they are thinking about rent, groceries, petrol, and whether their children will inherit a better country or a poorer, angrier one. That contrast comes through sharply. People are trying to pay their bills, and Washington is talking about the Third Temple and red heifers. That is not just a witty line. It captures the whole insanity of the moment. The ruling class is speaking a language so detached from ordinary life that it sounds almost like a parallel universe. A genocidal, mystical, ideological, and geopolitical fever dream is colliding with the practical world of household budgets and social strain. West had always talked about Islamic religious extremism, but did you ever hear any of them openly pursuing Armageddon and total annihilation of the human race, or making them subservient of the Zionists? And it is the practical world that always collects the debt. The economic side of this is impossible to ignore. Oil, gas, shipping, the Strait of Hormuz, Gulf production, LNG, investment flows. These are not abstract strategic terms. They are the bloodstream of the modern economy, and the argument is clear. This war puts a knife to that bloodstream. Once the Gulf is destabilized, once shipping is threatened, once the great energy arteries of the region are squeezed, Americans feel it, not only Europeans, not only East Asians, not only the Gulf monarchies. Americans too. Higher fuel prices, more inflationary pressure, more market anxiety, more pressure on an already brittle economy, and if the conflict drags on, that pressure compounds. That is one of the most striking themes in the conversations. The people cheering escalation rarely speak honestly about cost. They speak in abstractions. They talk like imperial romantics. But the costs are concrete, and they arrive fast. One participant warns plainly that if the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively shut, oil could explode in price. Another points to early signs of economic pain already emerging. Another stresses that this war is already costing the United States vast sums every single day. Another notes that Gulf states themselves are furious because the war places their economies, infrastructure, and investment models under direct threat. None of that sounds like a war fought in America's interest. And the charge of incompetence only sharpens the point. This is not being presented as a calculated defense of American interests, but as a reckless, improvised, and increasingly incoherent operation in which the goals change constantly while the costs become steadily clearer. There is something almost surreal in the spectacle of threatening to escort shipping through Hormuz under direct Iranian fire, of talking up quick victory when the conflict is already widening, and of speaking as though America can simply impose a post-war order by force of will. Even before one asks whether the war is moral, one must ask whether it is sane. And then there is the military cost. This is where the illusion becomes especially dangerous. Americans are being asked to believe, once again, that superior firepower equals strategic advantage, that because the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy can bomb, it can control, that because it can destroy, it can shape outcomes. But we are relentless on this point. War is not won by PowerPoint confidence or press room swagger. It is won by logistics, stockpiles, sustainability, public will, strategic clarity, and an end state that makes sense. Where is that here? Instead, what emerges is a picture of depletion. Interceptor stockpiles are strained, munitions are finite, radar and military assets are being hit, forward positions are vulnerable. There is deep anxiety about what this conflict is doing to America's wider strategic posture, from the Gulf to South Korea to Japan to Taiwan. In other words, even if one thinks only in the coldest imperial terms, this war still looks foolish. It burns through capacity, attention, and credibility in one theater while weakening America's position in others. That is not grand strategy. It is strategic vandalism. And there is no credible end state. What exists instead is a fantasy of repeat performance, the idea that Iran can be handled like Venezuela, that decapitation will trigger an uprising, that a substitute ruler can be found, that victory can be declared before the markets panic. That fantasy matters because it shows how detached the planners are from the scale, complexity, and civilizational depth of Iran itself. And the deeper one goes, the worse it looks, because the most dangerous wars are not only expensive and bloody, they are wars without a truthful explanation. One of the recurring complaints is that the official justification keeps shifting. First one reason, then another, nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, terrorism, regime change, regional order, unconditional surrender. The language moves because the true objective cannot be spoken plainly in a way that serves the American public. And when the stated reason for a war keeps changing, it usually means the real reason is one the public might reject. That matters, because a republic cannot fight endless wars on moving explanations forever without poisoning itself. A nation can endure sacrifice if people believe the sacrifice is necessary and honest. What it cannot endure indefinitely is being manipulated into risk by people who refuse to level with it. That is why the tone is so bitter. The complaint is not only that the war is dangerous, it is that the war feels fraudulent. The people pushing it do not speak like people defending the homeland. They speak like people pursuing something else entirely, and hoping the public will not notice the gap. By now, many have noticed, and there is another ugly detail here. The sense that the Zionist puppy United States Epsteinarchy entered this war, not merely without strategic clarity, but without serious contingency planning for a long conflict, a regional energy shock, or a failure of the hoped-for political collapse in Tehran. In that sense, the danger is not only that the war harms American interests, it is that those directing it seem not even to have thought seriously about the consequences of their own escalation. And that leads to the alliance question, which is even more damning. If this war were in America's interest, it would strengthen the alliances that actually matter to American stability. But the opposite case is made repeatedly. Gulf states are enraged. Their territory has become a battleground. Their trust in Washington is collapsing. Their investment assumptions are being shaken. Meanwhile, East Asian allies are forced to watch American military resources being drained and redirected. What message does that send to countries that were told the United States is the dependable center of a security order? What message does it send when America appears willing to exhaust itself for one client while everyone else is told to wait, hope, and absorb the consequences? That does not strengthen American leadership. It corrodes it. And then there is the domestic political cost, which comes through with real urgency. This war is not landing on a healthy, unified country. It is landing on a tired, distrustful, divided one. A country already exhausted by elite failure, institutional deceit, cultural hatred, economic uncertainty, and civic breakdown. Into that already frayed society, this war injects more suspicion, more censorship pressure, more propaganda, more accusations of treason, more attempts to criminalize dissent, and more reasons for citizens to conclude that the people in charge do not care what they think. Even on the narrowest political terms, it is madness. One of the central insights here is that this is not just about Republicans losing support or Democrats gaining ground. It is about a far more dangerous process, the collapse of trust in the entire political script. The anti-war coalition that helped fuel Trump's rise feels betrayed. Citizens who thought they were voting for sovereignty now see subordination. People who already suspected that Washington was lying feel confirmed in that suspicion, and a country that stops believing its own institutions is not a country made stronger by foreign war. It is made brittle. There is a phrase hovering over all this, even when not stated directly: imperial overstretch. But even that sounds too clean, too historical, too almost respectable. What is actually being described is something messier and more shameful than overstretch. It is a country allowing itself to be drawn into danger without a clear national purpose, without honest public consent, without strategic clarity, and without any serious answer to the question of why. Why this war? Why now? Why for America? No persuasive answer comes. And that is the heart of the matter. The war is sold as strength, but it produces weakness. It is sold as order, but it spreads instability. It is sold as necessity, but its benefits to the United States remain obscure while its costs are immediate and obvious. It is sold as a defense of civilization, but it accelerates moral, political, and strategic decay. So no, this is not in America's interest. It is in the interest of those who use America. And the longer that remains true, the more the American people will be asked to pay for a project that is not theirs, with money they do not have, for goals they did not choose, in a war that makes their own country poorer, less free, and less secure. That is not national interest. That is national sacrifice without national purpose. Israel's interests and America's interests are diverging. One of the biggest lies in modern Western politics is the lazy claim that the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States are basically the same. That line has been repeated so often by so many people for so many years that it has acquired the status of something beyond debate. It is treated as obvious, natural, almost sacred. To challenge it is to invite outrage. To examine it too closely is to risk crossing some invisible anti-Semitic line. And yet, once you step back from the slogans and look at the picture, the opposite conclusion becomes very hard to avoid. It is indeed anti-Semitic and anti-humanity to support the genocidal, barbaric Zionist Epsteinarchy of Israel. Israel's interests and America's interests are not the same. Not in this war, not in the wider region, not in the economic consequences, not in the alliance consequences, and not in the kind of future each side appears willing to accept. That divergence is not a side issue. It is the key to the whole crisis, and it can be stated more directly than Washington ever dares to say it. The real issue was not really the nuclear file at all, but the destruction of Iran's missile umbrella, because without doing so, Israel would lose freedom of action. That is a specifically Israeli strategic concern. It is not the same as an American national interest. On the contrary, it underlines the broader point that Washington is being pushed into a war whose deepest logic belongs elsewhere. Because if this war made clear, obvious sense for the United States, then the destruction, the depletion, the instability, and the political cost might at least be explained in recognizably American terms. You could say, here is the hardship, but here is the gain. Here is the danger, but here is the national purpose. Here is why Americans are being asked to absorb the risk. But that case never arrives. Instead, what emerges is something far more disturbing. America needs one thing from the region, while Israel appears to need another entirely. America, in the plainest and most practical sense, needs stability. It needs shipping lanes that function. It needs energy flows that remain open. It needs Gulf states that trust it enough to keep investing, cooperating, and aligning with it. It needs military resources that are not being drained pointlessly. It needs to avoid detonating wider crises that raise prices, unsettle markets, and weaken its position in other parts of the world. Even if one strips away every ideal and looks at the matter through the coldest strategic lens, America's interest is obvious enough. A stable region, manageable balances, no giant economic shocks, no open-ended war, no spiraling refugee catastrophe, no self-inflicted collapse of credibility with allies. That is the American interest. But the picture of Israel is very different. Israel is described not as a status quo power looking for calm, but as a state pursuing regional hegemony, willing to accept extraordinary levels of chaos, so long as rivals are broken, fragmented, weakened, or removed. That means Iran. It means Lebanon. It means Syria. It may mean others too. The logic is not peace but domination. not equilibrium but supremacy, not regional order in any shared sense but the destruction or neutralization of any force that might constrain Israeli freedom of action. Zionist supremacist ideology is anti-human race. They seek genocide, dehumanization, oppression, murder, barbarism, blackmail to conform, and annihilation of the inferior race. Once you see that distinction, much else begins to make sense. Why does a policy that looks irrational from Washington suddenly become rational if viewed from Jerusalem? Why does a war that threatens global energy routes, strains American stockpiles, angers Gulf partners, and weakens U.S. standing still get pushed so aggressively? Why does the acceptable level of collateral damage, instability, and civilizational wreckage seem so high? Because what counts as a disaster for America may still count as a strategic gain for Israel, provided the right enemies are weakened badly enough. That is the divergence, and it is severe. One of the sharpest points in the argument is that America actually has an interest in a stable Iran, or at the very least, in a non-collapsed Iran. Not because Washington ought to like Tehran, not because they are allies, but because the alternatives are worse. A giant civil war, a shattered state, a regime change disaster, a regional firestorm, refugees pouring outward, shipping in chaos, oil and gas under permanent threat, major powers pulled in deeper, the Gulf frightened, Europe destabilized, Turkey further inflamed, the whole region turned into an even more violent pressure chamber than it already is. The lesson from the genocidal Israeli Zionist-induced war in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Libya all points us to one conclusion. Zionists wants the Middle East to be engaged in forever tribal wars so that they can ensure their regional hegemony. None of that serves the United States. But from the perspective described here, Israel is willing to accept exactly those outcomes if they destroy a regional rival. This is one of the most important and unsettling claims in the argument, that where America sees danger in disorder, Israel may see opportunity. Where America should see a need for restraint, Israel sees a need to finish the job. Where America needs a functioning regional system, Israel needs the opposite and perhaps benefit from the fragmentation of that system if it clears the field around it. That is why the repeated line that America needs stability, Israel benefits from chaos, lands with such force. It is not just rhetoric, it is an organizing principle. It explains why the same event can be experienced by one side as self-damage and by the other as acceptable escalation. It explains why the political class in Washington ends up sounding so unconvincing when it tries to package this as an American war for American benefit. The fit is too awkward. The language strains. The motives keep shifting. The public senses the mismatch, and that mismatch becomes visible not only in military logic, but in economic and diplomatic consequences too. Take the Gulf. From an American point of view, terrifying the Gulf monarchies is reckless. These states may not be democratic paragons, but they are deeply embedded in the American order as it currently exists. In reality, these regimes are American puppets. They recycle money, they anchor energy systems, they host bases, they matter. For Washington to allow them to become exposed, panicked and furious is strategically absurd. Without U.S. protection, these puppet regimes will fall within months, yet that is exactly what this war is doing. Their bases are hit. Their security model is exposed as a racket that failed when tested. Their confidence in U.S. protection starts to crack. Their trust weakens. Their incentive to hedge away from Washington grows stronger. Again, terrible for America. But from the perspective mapped here, that kind of broader destabilization does not necessarily deter Israel at all. If the region becomes more volatile but Israel emerges stronger relative to its neighbors and rivals, then the cost is accepted. America may lose trust, influence, money, and room for maneuver. Israel may still gain strategic space. That is not a shared interest. That is an increasingly obvious conflict of interests, and the conflict may run deeper still. One way of reading this war is that Washington's preferred fantasy was a quick decapitation and managed political replacement, while Israel's deeper project runs towards fragmentation, internal division, and permanent weakening of Iran. In other words, even within the same war, The two states are not clearly aiming at the same political outcome. That makes the American claim that this is simply a shared strategic mission sound even more hollow. The same can be said of Europe. Europe appears not as a beneficiary of this course, but as one of its collateral victims. More instability in the Middle East means more pressure on Europe. More migration, more social strain, more political division, more energy panic, more elite dishonesty, more civic exhaustion. For the United States, especially a United States still tied culturally and strategically to Europe, that should be a warning sign. A weaker, more fractured Europe is not a sign of a healthy Western order. It is a sign of wider decay. And yet the argument repeatedly returns to the idea that Israeli policy is not especially troubled by Europe's weakening, and may even benefit from it. Whether one agrees with that or not, it matters because it reinforces the core pattern. Where America and Europe would rationally seek cohesion, calm, and continuity, Israel's strategic horizon is framed as something else altogether. This point also helps explain one of the strangest features of the whole crisis: the extraordinary willingness of American Epsteinarchy political elites to bear costs that ordinary Americans can plainly see are not being borne for them. When a country is truly fighting for itself, the burden makes sense, even if it hurts. People may hate the war, but they understand the national claim. Here, that understanding never properly forms. The reasons feel imported, the priorities feel borrowed, the language feels secondhand. The public hears talk of history, destiny, survival, existential stakes. But the existential stakes being described do not sound recognizably American. They sound like someone else's emergency presented as America's duty, and that is why this section matters so much. Because once the divergence between Israel's interests and America's interests becomes clear, the rest of the argument hardens. The war is not just misguided, it is misaligned. The costs are not just unfortunate, they are being borne for ends that do not match the needs of the society paying them. The resulting anger is not merely anti-war, it is anti-subordination. It comes from the dawning recognition that American power is being spent in service of outcomes that injure America itself. That recognition changes everything. It means that the old formula, that support for Israel is support for America, no longer persuades in the same way as Epsteinarchy exposed everything, all the lies of the past. It means more citizens begin asking not just whether a given policy is moral, but whether it is even rational on American terms. It means that calls for loyalty sound less like patriotism and more like discipline. It means that every new sacrifice invites a forbidden question: if this does not serve us, then who exactly does it serve? And once that question is asked often enough, loudly enough, and plainly enough, a whole system of taboo begins to tremble, because the truth is simple, and simplicity is often what makes a truth so dangerous. America's interests are not Israel's interests. America needs stability. Israel, in this reading, is willing to burn through stability in pursuit of dominance. America needs functioning alliances. Israel's agenda places those alliances under enormous strain. America needs social peace, lower prices, strategic focus, and political trust. This war delivers the opposite. At that point, what remains is not a partnership of equals pursuing a common good. What remains is a superpower injuring itself to sustain the ambitions of a smaller state whose preferred outcomes would leave the superpower poorer, more hated, more divided, and less free. That is not alliance management. That is capture. The destruction of the West includes Europe. When people in Washington talk about wars in the Middle East, they often talk as if the damage stays there. It never does. It spills. It travels. It changes politics thousands of miles away. It reshapes economies, elections, borders, public trust, and social peace. It moves through oil prices, refugee flows, security scares, propaganda campaigns, and elite panic. And if there is one part of the West that has already learned this the hard way, it is Europe. That is why the argument does not stop with America. It keeps widening outward until Europe comes into view, not as some distant observer, but as one of the chief victims of this whole pattern. The claim is a grave one. The destruction of the West does not mean only the weakening of the United States. It includes the weakening, fracturing, and exhaustion of Europe as well. And to this end, Israel had been funding the far-right extremists while pushing refugees to Europe with a sole intention of destabilizing Europe. And once again, Gaza was part of that story, because Gaza did not merely destroy Western moral authority abroad, it also deepened the moral crisis within Europe itself. European governments spoke endlessly about human rights and international law when it was safe, fashionable, and geopolitically convenient. Then came Gaza, and suddenly the grand language shrank. The hypocrisy was visible. The cowardice was visible. The selective conscience was visible. European publics saw that too, just as the rest of the world did. So even before Iran enters the frame, Europe is already morally bruised, politically divided and led by Epsteinarchy elites that fewer and fewer people trust. Then the Iran war arrives, and the same European weakness is exposed in another register. Because what happens if the region is pushed into deeper chaos? What happens if Iran is destabilized, shattered, or driven into prolonged open conflict? What happens if Lebanon catches fire on an even larger scale? If Syria remains broken? If the Gulf becomes insecure? If shipping routes are choked? If energy shocks spread and large civilian populations are pushed to move? Europe does not sit outside that blast radius. Europe absorbs it. One of the clearest threads is that wars like this do not remain local. They create secondary crises, and Europe is especially vulnerable to them. Refugee movements are one part of that. Social division is another. Energy insecurity is another. The rise of angry, anti-establishment politics is another. The corrosion of trust in institutions is another. Each one on its own is destabilizing. Taken together, they become something larger. The long, slow fraying of a civilization that still pretends it is merely managing difficult events, when in fact it is being worn down by them. Europe knows this already, even if its leaders refuse to admit it honestly. The point can be made in blunt terms. Major population movements and regional breakdowns have already transformed European politics in the past. They helped fuel sovereignty revolts, anti-establishment movements, internal bitterness, and a loss of faith in the old governing parties. And now, with this war, the same mechanism threatens to begin all over again. Only this time it comes after years of compounding stress. Economic strain, energy crises, elite dishonesty, migration tensions, cultural fragmentation, security anxiety, and a widening gulf between rulers and ruled. Europe is not entering this crisis from a position of confidence. It is entering it already tired, and the tragedy is made worse by the caliber of Europe's leadership. There is a repeated contrast between an older European tradition, leaders shaped by the memory of catastrophic war, the need for continental peace and the seriousness of diplomacy, and today's class of managers, courtiers, and subordinates to the Zionist Epsteinarchy. The complaint is not only that Europe is weak, but that it no longer seems to understand its own purpose. Instead of acting as a civilizational force for restraint, balance, and peace, it behaves like a vassal bloc echoing Washington, while its own societies absorb the consequences. That matters enormously. A healthy civilization can absorb shocks. A brittle one cracks under them, and the Europe described here is brittle. It is ruled by Zionist Epsteinarchy elites who talk about values they no longer convincingly uphold, who attach themselves to American policy even when that policy is self-destructive, and who seem incapable of defending either their moral consistency or their own populations from the consequences of foreign adventures. The result is a continent that increasingly looks less like a sovereign actor and more like a pressure vessel. Then, when one sees the leadership from Spain and Ireland, one begins to see some hope for Europe. Push it hard enough and something gives. This is why the refugee question is not a side issue. It is one of the core strategic effects of this war. Destabilize a country as large and significant as Iran, or keep destabilizing the surrounding region, and the human consequences will not stay neatly in place. People move. They flee. They head for safety, real or imagined. They head for functioning systems, for welfare states, for places where the lights are still on and the state still pretends to be in charge. And in this pattern, Europe is often the destination. That is not a humanitarian abstraction. It is a political detonator. Because Europe's internal politics are already strained by the collision between elite rhetoric and lived reality, ruling classes speak one language about openness, rights, and historical duty. Ordinary people often experience another reality entirely. pressure on housing, schools, wages, services, neighborhood cohesion, and public safety, along with the constant instruction that to notice any of this too plainly is morally suspect. Add another wave of disorder from a new Middle Eastern war, and you do not strengthen Europe. You push it further into cynicism, anger, and fragmentation. That is part of what makes the claim so severe. The suggestion is not just that Europe suffers as collateral damage. It is that Europe's weakening may actually be tolerated, or even folded into the wider strategic logic of this whole approach. Whether through migration pressures, social exhaustion, energy shocks, or political destabilization, Europe becomes something to be used, strained and spent rather than preserved. For any honest believer in Western civilization, that should be a scandal. Because what is Western civilization supposed to mean if Europe itself can be repeatedly subjected to conditions that hollow it out from within? What exactly is being defended? Skyscrapers, slogans, military procurement. It cannot simply mean flags and speeches. Civilization means inheritance, continuity, beauty, public order, trust, culture, restraint, memory, and the ability of a people to remain itself across time. If policies generate the opposite, if they produce exhaustion, atomization, dishonesty, and permanent low-level crisis, then they are not defending civilization. They are degrading it. This point becomes sharper when energy enters the picture. Europe has already lived through what happens when energy systems are destabilized. Panic, price surges, elite improvisation, public anger, industrial strain, and deep political repercussions. The danger that war in and around Iran could send further shocks through oil, gas, and shipping does not hit Europe lightly. It hits an already weakened continent with another hammer blow. And the scale of that danger is not trivial. Gulf oil and especially Qatari gas matter enormously to Europe. Reserves are weak, and if Russia concludes that Europe should no longer expect relief from Russian supply either, then the squeeze becomes even more severe. It is worth noting at this point that the Zionist proxies blew up the Russian oil pipeline to Europe with the sole objective of destroying European economy. Europe is not merely facing another abstract geopolitical headache. It is facing the prospect of a compounded energy crisis arriving on top of all the other strains already described. So again, the same question arises. Who benefits from this? Certainly not Europe's ordinary citizens. Certainly not the workers, families, and aging populations who end up paying more for everything while being told to endure one more round of crisis in the name of principles their rulers no longer even apply consistently. Certainly not the social fabric of countries that are already frayed. Certainly not the political legitimacy of governments already distrusted. The answer, once more, appears to be that Europe is being asked to bear costs for a strategic direction that is not in its interest and may not even be in America's interest either. That is a chilling thought, and it changes the meaning of the word West. Because if both America and Europe are being weakened by the same cycle of war, propaganda, instability, and elite submission, then perhaps the West is no longer a coherent civilization defending itself. Perhaps it is a civilization being hollowed out by its own ruling classes, who still speak the language of values while sacrificing the very societies those values were supposed to protect. That is where this argument becomes more than geopolitical. It becomes civilizational in the deepest sense. A civilization does not die only when it is conquered from outside. It can also die by being exhausted from within, by lying too often, by betraying its own standards too openly, by loading pressure onto its own societies while refusing to speak truthfully about causes and consequences, by turning every crisis into another test of obedience, by demanding sacrifice without offering coherence, by teaching its citizens over and over again that the official story will always matter more than the reality they can see with their own eyes. Europe in this picture is living through exactly that process, not all at once, not in one dramatic collapse, but in stages. A migration shock here, an energy crisis there, a moral humiliation over Gaza, another war, another wave of instability, another official lie, another round of fear, another deepening of public mistrust, another fracture between elites and populations, another loss of confidence that anyone in power is acting for the societies they govern. This is how civilizations decay when they do not fall in a single blow. They are worn down, and the symbolism is powerful too. Gulf and Asian money, once comfortable in Dubai and other supposedly safe regional hubs, is already being imagined as moving elsewhere. Places once sold as secure nodes in a Western-led financial order now appear vulnerable, unstable, and exposed. That further supports the argument that the wider Western system is not simply being challenged from outside, but is losing the confidence on which its own order depended. And so when we say that the destruction of the West includes Europe, we do not just mean that Europe will face consequences. We mean something more serious. We mean that Europe itself is one of the main theaters in which the cost of this entire system will be paid, in its politics, in its social peace, in its public trust, in its identity, in its ability to govern itself honestly and coherently. That is not an accidental side effect. It is part of the story. And if Europe continues down this road, morally compromised by Gaza, politically weak over Iran, strategically dependent, socially strained, and led by people who seem incapable of saying no to any ruinous course once Washington has chosen it, then the phrase Western civilization will begin to sound less like a living inheritance and more like a museum label for something that once existed. The Gulf and the global order are turning away from America for years. The Gulf states lived inside a simple bargain. You do exactly as we say. You host the bases. You recycle the money. You buy the weapons. You price your energy the right way. You stay inside the American security order. In return, you get protection, or at least the appearance of protection. The stars and stripes fly over the bases, the deals keep flowing, the money moves through the right channels, and everyone pretends the arrangement is permanent. Then the war came, and the illusion shattered, because the bargain only works if the protector can protect. It only works if the patron brings security rather than danger. It only works if the price of loyalty is survivable. And the Gulf appears to have reached a deeply unsettling conclusion. The American order no longer offers safety. It offers exposure. That is a huge change. These states did not sign up to become sacrificial terrain in a war that serves somebody else's ambitions. They did not build their glittering towers, financial hubs, and investment empires so that their territory could become a firing range. They did not anchor themselves to Washington only to discover, at the moment of truth, that American power could turn their countries into targets while failing to shield them from the consequences, especially when those consequences are false flag attack from the genocidal Israeli terrorists under the false pretense of Iranian drone. That is why the anger matters so much. It is not routine diplomatic irritation. It is not the usual managed grumbling of client elites who know how to complain and still obey. It sounds more serious than that. It sounds like a shock to the whole underlying arrangement. Because once bases are hit, airspace is endangered, shipping is disrupted, hotels become potential military targets, and the wider region starts to wobble. The Gulf rulers are forced to ask the question they have spent decades avoiding: what exactly are we getting from this relationship now? And that question has no easy answer. The old answer was obvious enough: protection, stability, access to the global financial system, an American umbrella. But that umbrella now looks more like a lightning rod. It attracts the strike. It does not prevent it. The U.S. presence no longer reassures. It implicates. It turns Gulf territory into part of the battlefield. It makes them pay the price of decisions they did not truly control. And the strategic issue is bigger than bases being hit. What is being contested now is control of sea lanes, choke points, and the movement of energy itself. Iran is not merely retaliating tactically. It is contesting the whole American system of maritime dominance across the Gulf and adjacent waterways. That is a much bigger point, because it shifts the frame from regional escalation to a struggle over the architecture of global power. That changes everything. One of the sharpest insights in the argument is that the Gulf states are finally seeing the arrangement for what it is, not a partnership among equals, but a hierarchy in which their role was always to serve the needs of Washington and beyond Washington, the needs of Israel. They sold in dollars. They invested in the American economy. They poured money into Wall Street. They funded initiatives handed to them from above. They accepted the military architecture placed on their soil. And now, when they most need the system to justify itself, they discover that they are not being protected from war, but pulled into it. That kind of revelation does not leave a political order unchanged. It plants the seed of strategic doubt, and once strategic doubt enters the room, money follows. There is a dawning awareness that the economic side of the American-led order may no longer be secure either. If Gulf rulers begin to conclude that the security guarantee is rotten, why should they continue to organize their financial life around the assumptions that came with it? Why should they keep treating the American system as the natural destination for their wealth? Why should they endlessly underwrite an order that now threatens their own survival and prosperity? This is why the talk about pulling investment, revising commitments, and rethinking the old flow of petrodollars matters so much. It is not just about one reaction to one war. It points to something more structural. The possibility that the Gulf puppets are beginning to imagine a future in which dependence on Washington is less of an asset and more of a liability. That is a dangerous thought for the American order, because the American system has not rested only on aircraft carriers and bases. It has rested on habits, on financial gravity, on the assumption that there is nowhere else to go. The Gulf monarchies, for all their wealth, were taught to behave as though their safest move was always to stay inside the dollar system, inside the American security orbit, inside the old imperial circulation of money, arms, and guarantees. But if that orbit now looks unstable, coercive, and self-destructive, the instinct to hedge becomes irresistible. And hedge toward what? Several directions are now imaginable. Some wealth may leave exposed Gulf centers. Some may avoid the dollar. Some may move towards Asian systems, including non-Western gold markets and other alternatives to American financial instruments. Whether or not that process is immediate, the political significance is clear. Once rulers and investors begin actively imagining life outside the old American circuit of protection, finance, and energy, the psychological monopoly of Washington begins to break. That is where the global order enters the story. One of the clearest emerging themes is that America is not just alienating Gulf rulers, it is driving them toward alternatives. Russia is repeatedly presented as a power that can talk to everybody in the region. China is presented as a giant economic pole waiting quietly in the wings. The old assumption that whatever frustrations existed, Washington was still the indispensable center begins to weaken. In its place comes a messier but more realistic picture. The Gulf states looking around, calculating, repositioning, wondering what happens if the American century is not ending with a bang, but with a long, humiliating strategic stumble. This is about more than diplomacy. It is about belief. A world order survives not just because it is feared, but because people think it will last. They park wealth in it because they trust its continuity. They obey its signals because they think its power will still matter tomorrow. They shape their futures around it because they assume it remains the central fact of international life. Once that belief begins to crack, even slowly, the consequences are immense. States diversify. They hedge. They whisper. They test alternatives. They stop assuming that America is forever. That is what this war appears to be accelerating. And the more tragic part is that it is happening not because Washington is being defeated cleanly by some superior rival, but because it is discrediting itself through its own conduct. It is frightening allies, exposing clients, burning through trust, and forcing people who once depended on it to start imagining life after it. That is how hegemonies really weaken. First in the mind, then in the money, then in the alliances, and only later in the formal declarations everyone notices. The Gulf, in that sense, is not just another theater. It is a warning light. Because if the very states that spent decades tying themselves to Washington now begin to think that the relationship has become existentially dangerous, then the problem is not tactical, it is systemic. It means the old formula, American power plus Gulf money plus regional compliance, is no longer functioning as it once did. It means the machinery is seizing up. It means the fear of Iran is no longer enough to force obedience if the American presence itself is what is drawing the danger closer. And there is a deeper humiliation here, too. For years, the Gulf monarchies were treated as proof of American success in the region. Rich, disciplined, aligned, controlled. Now they look more like evidence of a racket gone sour. They paid into the system and got dependence. They bought into the system and got vulnerability. They trusted the system and got war. No ruler can look at that and feel calm. This is why the argument is so severe. The Gulf is not merely irritated with America. It is being taught in real time that its future may depend on loosening the very relationship it once thought indispensable, and if that lesson sticks, even partially, then the consequences spread outward. The petrodollar system weakens, financial assumptions shift, diplomatic room opens for Russia and China. The wider world watches and takes note. If even the Gulf begins to hedge away, then perhaps the American-led order is less fixed than it looked. And if Washington's larger objective has indeed been to dominate energy corridors and sea lanes, as a way of coercing not only Iran but also Russia and China, then the stakes of this Gulf shift are even greater than they first appear. What is being shaken is not simply a regional alliance system, but part of the wider American effort to command the economic pressure points of Eurasia itself. That thought will travel fast. It will travel to capitals that already mistrust Washington, to elites that fear sanctions, to states that want room to breathe, to populations that are tired of American lectures, to governments that have waited for proof that the empire is not invincible but brittle. And in that sense, the Gulf's changing mood is not a regional side note. It is part of the beginning of a post-American imagination, not a settled post-American order, not yet, but the imagination of one. The first serious mental act of looking beyond Washington and asking, what if this does not hold? What if the protector has become the danger? What if loyalty to the old order now carries greater risk than breaking from it? Once enough states start asking those questions, the old order is already in trouble. So when we say the Gulf and the global order are turning away from America, we do not mean that tomorrow every ruler will denounce Washington and tear down every base. Power does not unravel so theatrically. What we mean is more important and more realistic. The confidence is beginning to go, the faith is thinning, the hedging has begun. The center no longer looks secure enough to command the same kind of instinctive deference, and that is how empires begin to lose the world. Not all at once, but ally by ally, investment by investment, doubt by doubt. The myth of American military omnipotence is breaking. Every empire depends on a story about itself. For the United States, one of the most powerful of those stories has been military omnipotence. Not just strength, which all great powers claim, but something bigger. The sense that American power is overwhelming, limitless, technologically untouchable, and ultimately irresistible. The details could be debated. Particular wars could go badly. But the myth always remained. America might make mistakes, but if it truly chose to act, who could really stop it? That myth is now beginning to crack. And one reason it is cracking is that the destruction of the American eyes in the Gulf has been so severe. The big radar systems feeding the digital battlespace are being destroyed. The early Iranian salvos were not even the most advanced part of the arsenal, but older stocks used to exhaust interception capacity. That is devastating to the myth of omnipotence, because it suggests that what the West has seen so far may not even be the full test. Not because the United States has become weak overnight. It has not. It still possesses devastating destructive power. It can still bomb, still threaten, still ruin, still level, still kill on an extraordinary scale. But destructive power is not the same thing as omnipotence. The ability to destroy does not automatically bring the ability to control events, dictate outcomes, impose order, or secure obedience. And that distinction matters because this war is exposing the gap between what American power can destroy and what it can actually achieve. That is a dangerous gap for any empire to reveal. You can hear the disbelief in the conversations. The official story says one thing: severe damage inflicted, control maintained, systems working, superiority intact. But the wider picture says something else. Bases hit, radar destroyed, stockpiles strained, interceptors depleting, allies unnerved, logistics under pressure, escalation options narrowing, and all of it taking place in a conflict where the desired political end state remains vague, unstable, or completely unrealistic. That is not what omnipotence looks like, and the military logic underneath the crisis makes the point even clearer. One's decentralized command structure, Buried missile systems and silo-based launches mean that decapitation and airstrikes do not automatically cripple its capacity to fight. That directly challenges the old Western assumption that enough bombing, enough technology, and enough precision can always break the enemy's ability to continue. Omnipotence is supposed to look clean, confident, controlled, disciplined. It is supposed to make the other side feel hopeless and your side feel secure. But what comes through here is almost the opposite. The United States and Israel still retain massive firepower, but beneath the noise there is a growing sense of anxiety, improvisation, and overreach. The more loudly officials boast, the more the situation seems to require boasting, and that is usually a sign that the old psychological advantage is under strain. The military aura is fading. That aura has always mattered more than people admit. A great deal of imperial power rests not simply on what an empire can do, but on what everyone believes it can do. Fear does half the work. Reputation does the rest. States comply because they think resistance is futile. Allies obey because they think the center is solid. Markets trust because they assume the strategic machinery is still fundamentally in command. But once enough people start to notice limits, once enough systems show vulnerability, once enough untouchable assets get touched, the whole atmosphere changes. And that is precisely the atmosphere now. Again and again, the point returns. The old confidence is being challenged. Radar can be struck, bases can be struck, logistics can be disrupted. Launchers cannot be found as easily as official briefings imply. Interceptors are not infinite. Munitions are not infinite. Air supremacy does not equal political victory. Bombing does not solve the problem if the problem is larger than the bomb. You can destroy targets and still find yourself trapped in a conflict that is making your wider position worse, not better. That is what an empire hates most, not merely resistance but visible limits, because visible limits teach lessons. They teach clients that the protector may not be as invulnerable as advertised. They teach rivals that endurance might matter more than fear. They teach publics that the official script can be punctured. And they teach the empire itself something it never wants to hear, that escalation does not always restore authority and may in fact expose weakness even more brutally. This is why the argument spends so much time dwelling not only on the destruction being inflicted but on the mismatch between means and ends. America and Israel can inflict immense damage. No one denies that. Civilian populations can be terrorized, infrastructure can be flattened, cities can be pounded. But then what? What political outcome follows? What durable settlement? What stabilizing achievement? What coherent victory? There is a repeated and almost mocking insistence that these questions remain unanswered, and where they are answered, the answers sound deranged. Regime change, unconditional surrender, choosing the next leader of another country, ground invasion fantasies, Kurdish incursions, long war plans with no clear end. This is not the language of controlled strategic superiority. It is the language of a delusional narcissistic imperial mindset that still imagines it can command reality because it can threaten it. But reality is not complying. That is the story underneath the military discussion. The United States is not powerless, far from it, but it is immensely destructive while increasingly less able to convert destruction into strategic success. It can blow holes in things without necessarily shaping what comes after. It can terrify but not govern. It can escalate but not necessarily achieve. Its instruments remain fearsome, but the conditions under which those instruments once guaranteed submission are changing. And once that becomes visible, other illusions begin to wobble too. Take the language of air superiority. In the abstract, it sounds decisive, but it is treated with skepticism, almost contempt. Air superiority over what, exactly? To what end? America had air superiority elsewhere too. That did not produce stable triumph. It did not make occupation easy. It did not eliminate political resistance. It did not create legitimacy. It did not turn shattered societies into manageable ones. So when the old phrase is repeated now, it does not inspire confidence the way it once might have. It sounds like a familiar line from an old play. And that is what makes this moment so revealing. Because the old military myth depended on the idea that if the United States truly decided to apply itself, the result would be obvious, swift, humbling, final. But what we hear instead is the opposite. concern about attrition, concern about depletion, concern about sustainability, concern about political consequences, concern about domestic backlash, concern about regional spillover, and concern that every escalatory move simply opens the door to another one. That is not the psychology of invincibility. It is the psychology of a power that still has overwhelming tools but no longer possesses the old ease of using them. The ground invasion question makes that especially plain. The very idea is treated as madness. Iranians are proud people with unparalleled history. They fought then American puppet Saddam Hussein for 8 years and sacrificed millions in fighting that genocidal regime that used U.S.-provided chemical weapons on the Iranians. Not just because it would be morally catastrophic, though it would be, but because it would expose the hollowness of the rhetoric instantly. The real invasion would require forces, logistics, mobilization, public will, reserves, political consent, and losses on a scale the American system can barely contemplate honestly. The fantasy of simply overwhelming Iran through willpower and machinery collapses the moment one asks how that would actually work in the real world. And that matters because it shows that even the ultimate threat, boots on the ground, has become less a credible strategic option than a sign of delusion. The old empire could at least pretend it had such options in reserve. The empire described here talks about them in the language of cinema, while the practical conditions that would make them possible have eroded. That is not strength. It is theater, and Hormuz is a perfect example. The proposal to escort shipping through a narrow waterway under Iranian threat is not proof of confidence, but evidence of delusion. This narrow waterway can easily be bit with traditional artillery shells without the need of any advanced military systems. No credible military mind will articulate such an insane plan to escort the oil tanker, given the threat posed by the Iranians' military. It shows the imperial center, still speaking in the language of invulnerability, while the actual military environment has become far more dangerous and far less controllable than the rhetoric admits. This is also why the destruction of military assets in the region carries such symbolic force. Not because each asset is, by itself, the end of anything, but because symbols matter, the image of American systems being hit, of expensive technologies proving finite, of strategic depth looking thinner than advertised. All of this chips away at the central imperial claim that the machine is too large, too sophisticated, and too backed by history to be seriously challenged. Once the challenge is seen, even partially, the myth begins to die, and when a military myth begins to die, the political consequences are enormous. Allies start to ask whether Washington can still guarantee what it promises. Rivals begin to calculate differently. Domestic populations become less willing to accept endless sacrifice for victory when victory itself looks blurred. The media must work harder to sustain confidence. Official language becomes more frantic. The gap between performance and reality grows wider, and the empire, in a sense, becomes more dangerous, because powers that sense decline often overcompensate with more brutality, more symbolism, and more desperate shows of force. There is a repeated sense that the exposure of weakness does not make the imperial center calmer. It makes it more reckless, more tempted by absurd escalations, more tempted by grand gestures, more tempted by fantasies of decisive punishment that somehow restores the aura. But aura, once damaged, is not easily repaired by more force. Sometimes more force only confirms the damage. That is where the United States and the wider West may now be heading. Not toward immediate military collapse. That would be too simple and too dramatic. But toward something subtler and perhaps more serious. The gradual unraveling of belief in military omnipotence. The slow recognition among allies, rivals, and citizens alike that the empire can still burn the world but cannot shape it as confidently as before, that its systems are formidable but not limitless, that its threats remain dangerous but no longer magically decisive, that its violence is real but its mastery is not what it once claimed. That is a profound shift, because an empire can survive many things, but the loss of its aura is hard to reverse. Once people stop instinctively believing in its inevitability, they begin to imagine alternatives. They hedge, they resist, they disobey, they wait, they test the boundaries, and with every test that reveals another limit, the myth weakens further. That is what this war is exposing. Not the total collapse of American military power, but the beginning of the end of the idea that American military power is enough to settle reality. And for the West as a whole, raised on that idea for decades, that may prove one of the most destabilizing revelations of all. The war abroad means repression at home. Wars do not stay on the battlefield. They come home. They come home in language first, in the narrowing of what may be said, in the sudden appearance of forbidden questions, in the pressure to choose sides, to fall in line, to repeat the official script even when it makes no sense. Then they come home in institutions, in policing, censorship, intimidation, surveillance, blacklists, career threats, and the quiet punishment of anyone who refuses to clap at the right moments. That is one of the clearest warnings running through the argument here. This war is not only a danger abroad, it is a danger to liberty at home. And if history teaches anything, it is that this is not an accident. Foreign war has always been one of the easiest ways to tighten domestic control. Once a state can tell its citizens that the nation is under threat, that unity is sacred, that dissent helps the enemy, that criticism is dangerous, that words can kill, that questions are irresponsible, that wartime is not the moment for debate, then the whole atmosphere changes. Rights that look solid in peacetime suddenly become negotiable. Speech that looked protected suddenly becomes suspect. Governments discover new appetites. Institutions become more obedient. Corporations become more cautious. Media become more cowardly. And ordinary people start watching their words. You can feel that fear already. What is striking is that the concern is not merely theoretical. This is not some abstract future risk. It is something already gathering. Criticism of the war is being branded as anti-Semitic, as pro-Iran, as incitement, as treachery. Language is being escalated deliberately. First you are morally dirty, then you are socially dangerous, then you are politically suspect, then you are treated as a security problem. That latter matters. It is how a society prepares itself to punish dissent without having to admit openly that this is what it is doing. The pattern is familiar. First comes the smear, then comes the isolation, then comes the warning, then comes the knock at the door. There is a repeated sense that this is exactly how the machine works now. If you criticize the war too forcefully, if you question the relationship between the United States and Israel too directly, if you suggest that American interests are being subordinated to something else, then the response is not argument. The response is to mark you, to put a label on you, to push you out of the category of normal, acceptable citizens and into the category of suspect people whose motives must be examined. That is how a free society begins to become frightened of itself. And the really dangerous part is that this process no longer depends entirely on the state. Repression in the modern West is not only governmental, it is distributed. A politician can smear you, a donor can pressure an institution, a media outlet can blacken your name, a platform can throttle your reach, a corporation can quietly cut you off, a university can panic, a think tank can exile you. A government department can review your speech. A security body can decide to pay attention. None of these actions alone may look like tyranny in the old dramatic sense. Taken together, they create a chilled society in which the formal right to speak still exists on paper, but the cost of using it rises higher and higher. That is a subtler form of repression, but it can be just as effective. There is fear not only for famous commentators or public figures, but for ordinary citizens, for smaller voices, for people with no platform and no protection. The real concern is not just that a major host may be smeared. It is that some unknown person with a few hundred followers, or a modest job, or a family to protect, may start receiving visits, warnings, threats, or institutional pressure for saying what should still be allowed to be said in a free country. That is when you know something deep has gone wrong. A healthy republic does not need to criminalize opinion. It does not need to turn attitudes into evidence. It does not need to suggest that disapproved thoughts are early forms of violence. It does not need to stretch words like incitement beyond recognition, so that criticism itself begins to look prosecutable. Yet that is exactly the atmosphere now, one in which the line between speech and crime is being deliberately blurred for political use. And this is where the war matters so much. because wartime is the perfect pretext. It always has been. In wartime, governments ask for emergency powers. In wartime, citizens are told the old freedoms are luxuries. In wartime, the demand for conformity grows louder. In wartime, officials can say that this is not the moment for endless debate, that enemies are watching, that loose words have consequences, that national unity must come first. Even people who normally defend liberty begin to wobble. They start making exceptions. They start saying, yes, free speech matters, but not now, not like this, not when the danger is so great. That is how freedoms erode, one special case at a time. This point becomes even starker once you notice how official lying works. The Pentagon and the political leadership are already under pressure to withhold or distort the true scale of damage and failure, because once the president publicly claims victory, the rest of the system must help preserve the illusion. And a state that cannot speak honestly about war will always become more tempted to silence those who do. This point becomes even starker once you notice how official lying works. The Pentagon and the political leadership are already under pressure to withhold or distort the true scale of damage and failure, because once the president publicly claims victory, the rest of the system must help preserve the illusion. And a state that cannot speak honestly about war will always become more tempted to silence those who do. Every major war of the modern age, the argument goes, has left America less free than before. War expands the state, it expands secrecy, it expands surveillance, it expands the appetite to regulate thought, language, and association. It builds machinery that rarely disappears fully afterwards. The emergency ends, the restrictions linger. The war recedes, the precedent remains. And that is why this war matters even to Americans who imagine they can simply ignore foreign policy. You cannot ignore a war once it starts rearranging the meaning of citizenship at home. You cannot ignore it when criticism becomes taboo. You cannot ignore it when the state and its allied institutions start deciding which opinions count as legitimate and which count as suspicious. You cannot ignore it when public speech is no longer governed by truth or argument, but by fear of punishment. At that point, the foreign war has already crossed the ocean. It is in the room with you. What makes the present situation especially dangerous is that the mechanisms are already there. They do not need to be built from scratch. The habits of censorship exist. The rhetoric exists. The bureaucratic pathways exist. The political willingness exists. The moral language used to justify the crackdown already exists too. It is the same language that so often comes dressed as concern, safety, anti-hatred, anti-extremism, community protection, and responsible discourse. The vocabulary sounds gentle. The function is not. And once that machinery is aimed at opponents of war, the possibilities widen quickly. Today it may be criticism of the genocidal barbaric Israel. Tomorrow it may be criticism of the war more broadly. Then it may be criticism of the wider security state, or of the intelligence agencies, or of the political and financial class driving policy, or of the whole architecture of influence that made the war possible. Once the principle is accepted that certain views are too dangerous to tolerate in wartime, there is no stable place to stop. The definition of danger expands to meet the appetite of power. That is why the tone is not merely worried but alarmed. This is not saying that repression might happen in some distant hypothetical sense. It is saying that the ground is already being prepared. The labels are already in circulation. The moral blackmail is already active. The pressure to self-censor is already real. The move from wrong to dangerous is already underway. And once a society gets used to that move, it can become frighteningly easy to justify measures that would once have seemed unthinkable. A war sold as liberation, proceeding alongside mass civilian casualties and escalating regional danger, while officials continue to insist that victory is near, creates exactly the kind of atmosphere in which censorship, smear, and coercion thrive. Once truth itself becomes politically dangerous, repression is never far behind. So the war abroad means repression at home in more than one sense. It means more state power. It means more censorship. It means more intimidation. It means more corporate obedience to political fear. It means more moral blackmail in public life. It means more pressure on institutions to show loyalty by punishing dissent. It means more citizens deciding it is safer to stay quiet than to speak honestly. And when enough people decide that, a nation may still call itself free, but it is no longer truly living in freedom. That is the deeper tragedy. Because the same citizens told that war is necessary for civilization may discover that civilization at home is being hollowed out by the very war they were asked to support. They were told they were defending values. Instead, they find those values narrowed, qualified, and patrolled. They were told the enemy was abroad. Instead, the atmosphere of suspicion settles over neighbors, colleagues, journalists, students, voters, and dissidents at home. That is not the defense of a republic. It is the corrosion of one. And here the argument loops back to the larger theme of this essay. A country that no longer governs itself abroad will not remain free at home. A Epsteinarchy ruling class that can be dragged into war against the national interest will eventually try to suppress the citizens who notice. A morally compromised political order that cannot defend its choices honestly will lean increasingly on taboo, smear, and fear. That is not a side effect of decline. It is part of decline itself. So when we say the war abroad means repression at home, we are not changing the subject. We are naming the price. The political consequences inside America wars do not just consume lives and money. They consume coalitions. They break promises. They expose frauds. They strip paint off political movements that looked solid until the pressure came. And that is exactly why this war matters so much inside the United States. It is not just a foreign policy crisis. It is a political stress test for the whole American system. And the early signs, if you follow the logic here, are grim. Because this is the kind of war that does not land on top of a confident, stable, prosperous country. It lands on top of a country already suspicious of its rulers, already divided, already exhausted by lies, already struggling with prices, jobs, housing, trust, and the sense that something in the basic arrangement of American life has gone badly wrong. Into that already tense and brittle society comes another war, another demand for loyalty, another plea for sacrifice, another wave of propaganda, another attempt to make dissent sound irresponsible, and another demonstration that the great issues of state are being decided somewhere above the ordinary citizen. That has political consequences, serious ones. One of the strongest threads is the sense of betrayal felt by the anti-war coalition that helped lift Trump. This matters because it goes to the heart of what the past decade of American politics has really been about. Trump was not only a candidate, he was, for many people, a vehicle for revolt against a ruling system that seemed incapable of learning from failure. Endless wars, elite immunity, economic neglect, institutional deceit, cultural contempt, the whole rotten style of official Washington. All of that was supposed to be what he represented a break from. That was the promise. Crude, messy, inconsistent, sometimes absurd, but still a promise. And now, with this war, that promise is totally broken. And what deepens that sense of betrayal is the picture of a leader still trying to imagine that victory can be declared. And the whole thing escaped, even as the war itself moves in the opposite direction. He seems trapped between his own grandiose claims, Israeli pressure, and a conflict that no longer resembles the quick success he appears to have imagined. That matters because it shows not merely weakness, but a profound mismatch between promise and reality. That is politically explosive, because voters will forgive many things if they think a leader is still basically on their side. They will forgive coarseness, inconsistency, even scandal, if they believe the larger direction remains true. But war is different. Endless war especially is different. It cuts through branding. It cuts through campaign nostalgia. It cuts through the emotional machinery of personality politics and asks a harder question: were you really different? Or were you simply another route back to the same destination? That is the question now hanging over Trump. And it is brutal because it does not come from his enemies first. It comes from people who once believed him. This feeling is unmistakable. The anger is not theatrical. It is not just partisan disappointment. It is something deeper. The anger of people who suspect they were used. They thought they were voting for sovereignty, for a break with the permanent war machine, for a state that would stop sacrificing them to causes they did not choose. Instead, they see the old logic creeping back in. The old imperial habits, the old Middle East obsession, the old manipulative rhetoric, the old demand that ordinary Americans accept more cost, more risk, and less honesty. That is how coalitions fracture, not always all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet hardening of disillusion. The moment when someone who defended you yesterday stops defending you today. The moment when trust drains and does not return. The moment when your own words begin to replay against you, and people hear not leadership but contradiction. This is why it matters that Trump did not win on Republicans alone. He won with a wider coalition. Younger voters, independents, people disgusted with the status quo, people who did not want to be dragged again into elite wars, sold with changing explanations. Those voters may not all be ideologues. They may not all talk in foreign policy terms. But they know betrayal when they smell it, and they smell it now. That has obvious implications for the Republican Party. A party can survive a policy error. It can survive scandal. What it struggles to survive is a crack in the emotional bond with its own voters. And this war threatens exactly that. It tells the base that all the rhetoric about putting America first may still collapse the moment the old foreign policy machine begins to turn. It tells skeptical voters that perhaps nothing really changes. It tells the anti-war right that its importance was temporary, useful, disposable. And it tells everyone watching that even after all the speeches, all the slogans, and all the postures about ending the old madness still rules. That is not just disappointing, it is corrosive. But the damage is not confined to one side. The Democratic Party may also be entering a new phase. Not because it has suddenly become principled, and not because its leadership is clean. Far from it. But because once the old taboo begins to weaken, once the scale of public disillusion grows large enough, some Democrats may sense political room to say things that would previously have been off limits. Public criticism that would once have been instantly crushed now starts surfacing, at least in cautious or performative form. That matters because it suggests the old consensus is cracking, and the pressure of war is forcing realities into public view that can no longer be easily hidden. That does not mean elites have become honest. It means the political ground is moving. Some Democratic voices are already beginning to edge away from the old pattern, however cautiously. That does not mean a clean break. But it does mean the old discipline is under strain. And once a consensus cracks, the whole political field changes. Suddenly subjects once treated as untouchable become discussable. Questions once ruled out of bounds become part of normal argument. Politicians who once bowed their heads begin glancing sideways to see whether there is now room to stand up. The mask does not come off all at once, but it slips. And in politics, even a slip can matter enormously, because it tells the public that they were not crazy for noticing the contradiction all along. That is how the Overton window moves. This war may be one of those moments, not because the establishment has become honest, but because reality has become so awkward, so expensive, so damaging, and so visible, that the old level of unified discipline becomes harder to sustain. Public anger grows, elite confidence weakens, contradictions multiply. Some people start running for cover, some start revising the script, some begin to distance themselves. None of this means the system has changed. It means the system is under pressure, and pressure matters, especially in a country like the United States, where so much of politics now rests on mood rather than conviction, on coalition management rather than belief, on image rather than trust. Once trust goes, image alone is not enough. A movement that once ran on the feeling of rebellion can suddenly start to look like the thing it claimed to oppose. A party that once defined itself as the anti-war alternative can start to look like a more vulgar version of the old war party. And once that perception takes hold, it is very hard to reverse. This is why one of the most important lines implied here is that there may be no going back from this. Not because the public will suddenly agree on everything. They will not. Not because a new party or clean movement will magically arise. It may not. But because the country has now seen too much. Too many contradictions, too many broken promises, too many changing justifications, too much moral blackmail, too much visible distance between what helps the rulers and what helps the ruled. Once those things become clear, the old innocence does not return. That is politically transformative even when it is not yet electorally organized. It means more cynicism, yes, but also more volatility, more willingness to believe that the system is rigged, more openness to outsider narratives, more appetite for blunt truth, even when spoken harshly, more contempt for institutional language, more suspicion whenever the media, the intelligence world, and the political class all begin speaking with one voice, more people willing to ask forbidden questions, more people prepared to break ranks, more social instability, more wild swings, more alienation. That is not healthy democratic correction. It is the politics of a country losing confidence in the basic fairness of its own system. And that is why this war could prove so consequential. Because if the movement that rose by channeling revolt against endless war is now seen as unable or unwilling to resist it, then the resulting disillusion will not simply melt away into normal partisan life. It will deepen the wider crisis of legitimacy. It will confirm the suspicion that elections change style but not substance, that the public is allowed to vote but not really to govern, that the wars continue, the taboos remain, the costs rise, and the same interests somehow keep winning. That is poison for a republic. It encourages not engagement but detachment, not trust but fatalism, not reformist hope but darker impulses. If enough citizens begin to believe that ordinary democratic means cannot alter the direction of the state on the biggest questions, then the whole political order becomes unstable in a new way. People begin looking for other exits, other forms of leverage, other ways to make themselves felt. And once a society reaches that stage, its politics become far more dangerous and far less predictable. So yes, the political consequences inside America are severe. This war threatens the anti-war coalition that helped shape the last decade. It threatens the credibility of the Republican revolt against the old foreign policy machine. It opens space for shifts on the Democratic side, however opportunistic. It weakens trust in institutions across the board. It deepens the sense that the public is being governed without meaningful consent. And above all, it teaches millions of people the same terrible lesson: that even when they vote against the system may still get what it wants, and the likely consequences will not be confined to opinion alone. A prolonged, unpopular war, layered onto economic instability, exposed official lying, and elite confusion, may well reshape the American political landscape far beyond the next news cycle. That lesson, once learned, does not stay contained to one election cycle. It becomes part of the national mood. And national moods, more than manifestos, are what decide whether a political order can survive. Civilizational decay. Beauty, order, truth, and meaning empires do not collapse only because they lose wars, money, or territory. Sometimes they collapse because they lose their soul first. That is the deeper argument running under everything here. Yes, there is talk of missiles, oil, shipping routes, military bases, elections, alliances, and censorship. All of that matters, but beneath all of it sits a more haunting question: what kind of civilization destroys beauty, lies about truth, rewards ugliness, and then still expects to be seen as the defender of order? That is where this story becomes bigger than geopolitics. Because what is being described here is not only strategic decline, it is civilizational decay. One of the most striking moments comes when the conversation shifts almost suddenly from military logic to beauty. Beirut, Gaza, Syria, Iran, old cities, churches, mosques, neighborhoods, places where people lived, prayed, argued, married, raised children, built memory, made meaning, places that were not just targets or terrain or infrastructure, but human worlds. The point made there is simple and devastating. A political order that treats beautiful things as disposable begins, at some level, to reveal what it has become. What did the genocidal barbaric Zionists do to this once great civilization? And what it has become is ugly. Not only physically ugly, though often that too, morally ugly, spiritually ugly, intellectually ugly. A civilization that no longer knows how to preserve beauty will start to destroy it by instinct of its Zionist demon. It will level ancient places and call it necessity. It will flatten neighborhoods and call it security. It will produce people who speak fluently about destruction but sound embarrassed by mercy, inheritance, or reverence. It will reward the efficient manager of ruin over the guardian of what is fragile and worth protecting. It fails to protect its children from Epsteinarchy, and fails to even express its inherent distress about murdering babies, women, and children by its Zionist masters. That is not a healthy civilization. That is a tired one. And when a civilization is tired in that way, truth goes with beauty, and nowhere is that clearer than in the way Iran is seen, Western elites do not understand Iran at all. Not its civilization, not its ethical world, not its social structure, not even the humanity of the people they are targeting. That is not merely a strategic error. It is a symptom of civilizational decay, the inability to see another people truthfully, except through propaganda, contempt, and racialized simplification. There is a constant sense that language itself is decaying. Words no longer mean what they say. Defense can mean escalation. Peace can mean submission. Law can mean selective enforcement. Terror can mean whatever the powerful need it to mean. Human rights can disappear when the wrong people need them. Journalism can become narration on behalf of power. And criticism can be turned almost by magic into hatred or treason. This corruption of language matters more than many people realize. The civilization depends on shared words that still point, however imperfectly, to reality. Once those words are systematically twisted, people lose confidence not only in leaders but in meaning itself. They stop trusting public speech. They assume every statement hides an agenda. They hear moral language as strategy, humanitarian language as cover, legal language as theater. And after a while, they become unable to imagine honest public life at all. That is a profound form of decay, because truth is not just a philosophical nicety, it is the basis of political sanity. A people cannot govern themselves if they are constantly lied to. They cannot deliberate if words are rigged. They cannot preserve a republic if official language becomes little more than a mechanism for managing perception. They become cynical, then exhausted, then passive, then angry. Eventually, they no longer know what to believe except that they are being manipulated. And that is exactly the mood the argument keeps circling. A civilization that no longer believes its own words, ruled by elites who cannot speak honestly because honesty would expose too much. Then there is order. The West still likes to talk about order. But what kind of order are we looking at now? Not the order of justice, restraint, continuity, and coherent public life. The order described here is closer to managed disorder. Endless emergency, endless instability, endless manipulation, endless war abroad, and increasing pressure at home. A world where the rulers still claim to stand for civilization while producing fragmentation everywhere they touch. A world where moral authority has been spent, public trust has been burned through, and force increasingly substitutes for legitimacy. That is not order in the true sense. It is exhaustion with branding, and people can feel the difference. They can feel it when every official explanation sounds synthetic. They can feel it when policy produces the opposite of what it claims to defend. They can feel it when the people who speak most grandly about values seem least bound by them. They can feel it when beauty is destroyed, truth is bent, and all that remains is the demand to obey. This is why the section matters so much. Without it, the whole article could sound merely political. But the real question is larger than politics. It is whether the West is now rotting at the level of meaning itself, whether the loss of moral authority in Gaza, the loss of sovereignty in the Iran war, the spread of repression at home, and the degradation of public speech are all symptoms of the same deeper illness, a Zionist infection in its soul. A civilization can survive hardship, it can survive military defeat, it can survive economic pain. What it struggles to survive is sustained contempt for truth, beauty, and order all at once. Because once those things go, the machinery may still stand for a while, but the spirit does not. That is why the destruction of places matters, not just because bombs kill, though they do, but because the deliberate destruction of what is lovely, sacred, or inherited says something about the destroyer. It reveals a civilization increasingly unable to see value except in dominance. Beirut is not just a city. Gaza is not just a battlefield. Southern Lebanon is not just a security buffer. Syria is not just a chessboard. Iran is not just a target map. These places are part of the human inheritance. To destroy them carelessly, repeatedly, and then speak of civilization while doing so is a form of blasphemy against civilization itself. And the West, in this account, has now tied itself to that blasphemy. That is why this is not merely a story of strategic misjudgment. It is a story of spiritual degradation. A ruling class that no longer blushes at mass suffering. A media class that narrates devastation with dead language. An intellectual class that twists itself into absurdity rather than admit what it can see. a public sphere where beauty carries less prestige than destruction, and where cynical power has more authority than moral seriousness. No civilization remains healthy for long under those conditions, and there is a spiritual contrast here that is hard to miss. The Iranian supreme leader appears not as the cartoon of Western propaganda, but as someone shaped by sacrifice, dignity, literacy, religion, and the willingness to die with his people rather than flee. Whether one agrees with that moral outlook or not, its presence matters because it throws the West's own ruling class into harsher relief: managerial, boastful, brutal, unserious, and strangely empty by comparison. And once you see it that way, the phrase, "the end of the West," begins to mean something more precise. It does not have to mean that every city falls or every institution disappears. It can mean that the civilization ceases to deserve itself, that it loses the habits, moral limits, and cultural instincts that once made it worth defending, that it becomes a shell, wealthy perhaps, armed perhaps, still loud certainly, but internally hollow, unable to distinguish power from greatness, propaganda from truth, domination from order. That is the civilizational danger now. Gaza proved the moral collapse. Iran is exposing the political and strategic collapse. But underneath both lies something older and sadder: a civilization drifting away from beauty, from truth, from restraint, from any real sense of the sacredness of human life and the things human beings build together. Once that drift becomes a habit, decline stops being a possibility and becomes a condition. And that is why this war feels like more than a war. It feels like a mirror. And what the West is seeing in that mirror is not flattering. It is seeing a civilization that still talks like a guardian of order while behaving more and more like an engine of ruin. Conclusion: the beginning of the end, unless Americans reverse it. So where does all this leave us? At a place the West has spent years trying not to look. Because once you follow the thread from Gaza to Iran, from moral collapse to political collapse, from foreign war to domestic repression, from strategic overreach to civilizational decay, the picture becomes hard to escape. This is not just another crisis, not just another Middle East war, not just another ugly chapter in the long story of American empire. This feels like the beginning of the end of something much larger. Gaza destroyed the moral authority of the United States and the wider West. That much is already done. The mask slipped. The language of law, human rights, and civilization was exposed as selective, conditional, and in many cases fraudulent. A political class that once claimed to lead the world morally showed that its principles could vanish the moment they became inconvenient. That wound is not cosmetic. It goes to the heart of what the West thought it was. Now the Iran war is exposing the next layer down. It is exposing that America may no longer be fully governing itself. It is exposing that its political class is willing to risk American lives, American wealth, American alliances, American liberty, and American domestic peace for goals that are never honestly stated in terms that make sense to ordinary Americans. It is exposing that the interests of genocidal Zionist Israel and the interests of the United States are not the same, however often that lie is repeated. It is exposing that Europe is not being protected by this order but weakened by it. It is exposing that the Gulf states are beginning to doubt the whole American bargain. It is exposing that even the myth of American military omnipotence is not what it once was. And it is exposing that whenever this system is challenged, the instinct of the rulers is not more honesty but more pressure, more propaganda, and more suppression of dissent. Put simply, the rot is now visible in every direction. And there is one more layer to that rot: elite incoherence. The war is not being driven by a serious American governing class with a stable objective, but by a confused mixture of compulsion, improvisation, fantasy, and bluster. That matters because decline becomes much more dangerous when those presiding over it no longer seem capable even of understanding the crisis they are deepening. And there is one more layer to that rot: Epsteinarchy elite incoherence. The war is not being driven by a serious American governing class with a stable objective, but by a confused mixture of compulsion, improvisation, fantasy, and bluster. That matters because decline becomes much more dangerous when those presiding over it no longer seem capable even of understanding the crisis they are deepening. Abroad, the United States looks less like the master of events, and more like a power being dragged into deeper crisis by forces it either cannot or will not resist. At home, it looks like a country where citizens are increasingly asked to surrender speech, trust, and independent judgment in the name of unity. In Europe, the wider Western project looks morally compromised, politically exhausted, and socially brittle. In the Middle East, the old security order is beginning to look like a racket that has turned on its own clients. And in the realm of civilization itself, beauty is being destroyed, truth is being twisted, and order is being replaced by managed chaos. That is not sustainable. No civilization can live indefinitely on hypocrisy, taboo, and force. No republic can survive if its people come to believe that the biggest decisions are made beyond their reach and against their interests. No alliance system can endure if the allies begin to conclude that the protector is also the danger. No political class can keep demanding trust after showing, again and again, that it will not speak plainly about who benefits and who pays. That is why this moment matters so much, because the issue is no longer simply whether this war is right or wrong. It is whether the American people are prepared to accept what this war reveals about the system ruling them. Are they willing to accept that their country can be pushed into another disastrous conflict under slogans that do not survive contact with ordinary life? Are they willing to accept that criticism of this process will increasingly be smeared, marginalized, and treated as suspect? Are they willing to accept a future in which their own society becomes poorer, more divided, less free, and more brittle while they are told this is the price of civilization? If they are, then the path ahead is clear enough. More wars, more lies, more censorship, more economic pain, more strategic decline, more moral humiliation, more cracks in the Western order, more exhaustion in Europe, more distrust at home, more destruction abroad, more distance between rulers and ruled, more of the same, only harsher. But if they are not, then this is the point at which something must finally be confronted. The cycle does not continue by magic. It continues because the people driving it still hold power, still shape the language, still define the taboos, still decide what may be questioned and what must remain unsaid. And as long as that remains true, the West will keep moving in the same direction. Away from truth, away from sovereignty, away from restraint, away from beauty, and toward a future in which it is feared less, trusted less, believed less, and eventually followed less as well. That is why the final burden falls, whether fairly or unfairly, on ordinary Americans. Not because they created this system alone, not because they control it fully, but because only they can ultimately break it. Only they can refuse the script. Only they can say that endless sacrifice for hidden genocidal Zionist interests is no longer acceptable. Only they can insist that their country must belong to its own people again. Only they can decide that a republic cannot continue to function as a machine for wars its citizens did not choose, and are not allowed honestly to debate. If they do not, then the process already underway will deepen, and history may look back on this sequence with terrible clarity. Gaza was the moment the West lost its moral right to lead. Iran may become the moment it began to lose the power to lead as well. And the conflict may become long, not short, structurally transformative, not containable, and politically disruptive not only in the region, but in the United States and Europe as well. That is what gives the warning its force. This is not simply another war, but a potential turning point in the unraveling of the old order. And if that happens, then this will not be remembered as one more war in a troubled region. It will be remembered as the point at which the American empire, and with it the old Western order, finally began to come apart in full view of the world, not because it was conquered from outside, but because it had already hollowed itself out from within after being infected by the GZEN virus.